For the Woodsmith Shop TV show, we built this green and green style bookcase. It features some glass doors, pair of drawers down below, but now it's time to apply some stain and finish. And what I wanted to do was talk about some of the strategies that go into finishing, especially a large project like this. Now, one of the first things to do is to go over everything with your final sanding. And it doesn't really matter what grit you work up to, just so long as every surface is sanded to that same grit. For this bookcase, I went up to 180. Now, I don't want to go much higher because the higher the grit you have, the less the stain will absorb into the wood on the bookcase. So you'll end up with a lighter color. If you sand to a lower grit, you might have more visible scratches, but you'll get a darker stain color overall. The other thing that we did is created a sample board here and played around with some of the stain colors that we have. Now, we're using Old Masters gel stains because I really like how much control you have with them. They go on pretty smoothly, as you'll see, and you can work them in with rags and brushes to be able to get exactly the color that you want. So we tried a few different stain colors, even went onto the edge of the piece here to try and find something that's going to play well with the mahogany that the bookcase is made from, but also, since this is going in someone's home, that the color was going to match some of their other pieces. So what we ended up going with is the cedar color, which sounds a little bizarre, but instead of looking at stain colors and their names by the materials that might be listed in, what you want to do instead is just go by the color. So for the cedar, what we end up here with is a pretty medium brown color with little hints of red. And it's always a good idea to do a sample board on the same material so you have an idea of what you're going with. Now you can see here the gel stain that we're using it's a pretty thick consistency. This particular batch looks a little bit like chocolate pudding. And I'm going to start applying the stain here, and I'm going to work from the inside out and then the top down just to avoid getting stain on me as much as possible. So that's why I got the gloves on, apron, and I want to spread out some paper to catch any drips so you're not covering the floor. The other thing you want to do is when you're starting is to work in different sections. So I'll start with the inside top, then I'll work the back panel, the two sides, and then the bottom panel. I'll apply it pretty liberally, brushing it out, and then when I get a section finished, I'll wipe down the excess with some cloths. Now you can use foam brushes like I have here, or rags, just kind of as a fielder's choice on what works best for you. All right, once you have the stain applied, you want to wipe down the excess. And what you're working on here is you want to blot up any excess puddles and drips and globs that are in there. But you can also use your cloth now to even out the color. And with the gel stain, you have plenty of time to work in the color. I find that once the rag has a little bit of stain on it, it helps you work the stain around and even out all the color. If you do end up with a place that has a little too much stain or it's starting to dry, it seems like on you, you can moisten the cloth with some mineral spirits and then freshen it up a little bit there and be able to keep working. And one more thing, as you're going along, you want to work with the direction of the grain, at least as your final pass. There's going to be some little corners and nooks and crannies where you're just going to have to get in there as much as possible, but try and take that final last pass with the direction of the grain. All right, I got the inside of the bookcase taken care of. I'm going to start on the outside, working from the top down. A couple of things to point out as you go along. Now, obviously on a bookcase, the inside is going to be visible. But down below where the two drawer compartments are, I'm not going to stain way on the inside there because the drawers are going to fill the space. I will, however, stain probably about an inch or two around the perimeter just to provide a nice color match that you might see when the drawers are still in place. Now, as you go along, you'll face one other decision, and what to do about the back of the case. The bookcase is going to live most of its life up against a wall, so nobody's ever going to see it. Do you need to stain it? No, you don't really, so I'll leave that up to you. But for some of the people out there who need to have everything match, then you want to go ahead and apply stain there. So the process is the same. Wipe on a generous coat and then blot up the excess. All the rags that you use to wipe down the stain with, you want to lay them out flat, hang them up to dry, and not just throw them straight into the trash. If they're all wadded up, they can cause spontaneous combustion. So for safety, let them dry out. They'll get nice and hard, throw them away. Now, ordinarily when I'm staining a drawer, I'm just going to do the drawer front because that's the part that you see, and the sides are usually made out of a contrasting material. Here though, with the protruding finger joints that we have going on, I'm going to apply stain to both the front and the two sides. But then I only want to get stain on the top edge, which is going to take some careful brush work. And the reason for that is I want to keep the inside of the drawer nice and light. It's easier to find stuff on the inside, and the stain can leave some lingering odors, and I want that to clear out as quick as possible. So I'll apply the stain just like I did before, wipe it down, and you'll see the look that I'm going for. All right, there we go. The stain is all applied. Now with an oil-based stain like this, I like to give it a good day, maybe even 2, just to make sure that it dries before applying a top coat, especially if you're going to use an oil-based top coat, because you don't want that to lift off the stain and start to muddy the look of it. So we'll come back in a couple of days and talk about finishes. All right, it's been a few days now with the stain drying on our bookcase. Took care of the doors and the drawers as well. So we're ready to put the final top coats on. And these are the clear finishes that are going to provide both the protection and a little bit of shine to this finished bookcase. Now I'm looking for something that's a little bit more satiny or matte than glossy, just because I think it's going to work well for where this bookcase is going to end up. So I want to show 2 options that you have for some oil-based finishes from Old Masters. Now the first one is your straight up tung oil, which is from a nut tree. And this particular finish is a little thicker, a little syrupy, and you can see has kind of a syrupy golden amber color. The other option is a tung oil varnish. And while they might sound the same, there are a little bit of a difference. The varnish obviously has a little bit of varnish in it. So that is going to be a much thinner product. You can see it's a little more watery coloring or watery in consistency. And it's also a darker color, but it still dries to a light amber tone. Now they're both going to go on the same way, but the tung oil varnish is going to dry a little harder than the straight up tung oil will. So I'm going to use the tung oil varnish. The process here is about the same. I'm going to work from the inside to the outside on the bookcase, applying a nice healthy coat, and then after I've applied it to a section, wiping it down. The side assemblies on this bookcase offer a good lesson on how to apply the finish. Now I started by, like I did with the whole case overall, working from the inside out. So I began by applying finish to the panels, working in the direction of the grain. That works fine for the top one. The lower one's pretty short, so that can be a little bit more problematic. From there, I moved out a little bit and did the horizontal rails, again working with the direction of the grain. Finally, by finishing up with long strokes on the posts or the legs of this bookcase. Then again, it's just wiping down the excess. You want it to still look wet, but you don't want to see any obvious drips or runs because they can harden in the finish. Now, just like with the stain, I really want to emphasize that you lay out your cloths on a flat surface so that they can fully dry out for safety. You don't want the oil in here to generate heat and then spontaneously combust. Once the varnish has fully cured and dried, then you can toss the rags into your regular trash. Finally, we're going to let this dry overnight, and then we'll come back and talk about adding a second coat and even third and fourth coats if necessary. The first coat of finish has dried on the bookcase, and while it might not look that much different from the screen, up close I can see that there is a little bit of a shine starting to build up on some of the surfaces. It's a little hit or miss though, depending on how the finish got absorbed. And you'll notice that this first coat goes on and gets absorbed by just the stain and the more or less uncoated wood. The second and following coats, you'll get a much quicker build on it. Now, I wanted to remove dust nibs, but I wanted to avoid sanding through the stain. So what I did instead was took a cork block and just wrapped some craft paper around it, just a grocery bag paper, and then I rubbed it all over the surface. For kind of the nooks and crannies or around the plugs, I just took a piece and folded it up and rubbed out most of those dust nibs. That leaves a pretty smooth surface for the most part, and I'll build up probably 2 or 3 coats in some areas and be able to sand those flat once I get a little bit more of a build. So we're ready to move on to applying that second coat, and the process is pretty much the same, where I'm just going to brush on a relatively heavy coat and then wipe it down so that it still looks a little wet, but still has a nice even sheen across it. Now, what I am going to start doing though is I'm starting to dropping off some surfaces. Down here on the drawer openings, I put some finish on the inside edges of those parts for a first coat, but I don't really need a second coat there because they're not going to get any wear and tear. Now it's one more day of waiting, and then we can start putting a third coat on some strategic locations. I'm just going to do that on the high traffic spaces. So the bottom of the bookcase, its top, and then the shelves as well. So you can kind of judge what you need to do based on its appearance as well as the amount of wear and tear or use that it's going to see. All right, here we are with the wrap up on our bookcase project, and you can see that everything turned out great. I ended up going with a few more coats of the tung oil varnish on here just to be able to get the level of shine that I wanted on it. Again, you just want to make sure that you rub out in between those coats like I did, using 400 grit sandpaper or even a little higher once you get to the end. The last thing I did when everything was done is kind of buffed it out with a little piece of grocery bag paper or craft paper that takes down those final nibs without doing any actual sanding on it. All in all, this was a great project to build and a fun project to finish, even with all the little nooks and crannies on it, and especially with the shop-made pulls that we did, blending right in with the color. I want to give a special thanks to Old Masters for providing the finishes. We used their cedar-colored gel stain in order to bring out the color of the mahogany that we built this bookcase from, and then, like I said, wrapped it up with a few coats of their tung oil varnish. And remember, when you're working with oil-based finishes, you want to spread out those brushes and rags and let them dry completely before throwing them away for safety. If you'd like to see the plans for this bookcase project, they're available at woodsmithshop.com. And if you have any questions or comments about finishing, just let us know.